We have spent the month of January looking at the miracles of Jesus, things that Jesus did. And now we're going to make a little bit of a transition to this next month as we're going to look at things that Jesus said. And what Jesus did is always more attractive and more appealing than what Jesus said. And it's the same with you. You're more into action than you are a sermon any day. And I understand that. If I was to broadcast and advertise, I'm today going to share a message that is really, really important to me, and I'm really excited about it, we would have about the same people that already come. But if I was to say today I'm going to heal a bunch of people and it's going to be crazy, we would have to find people in the parking lot to have a speaker out there to be able to hold everybody that wanted to be a part of that, because we're just drawn to that stuff. We're drawn to action. We're drawn to movement, not so much the messages. And most people, when they're looking at Scripture and they say, this is what I love to read, this is my favorite verse, this is my favorite part of the Bible, very few people go to Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7. And probably because it's often referred to traditionally as the Sermon on the Mount. And it just doesn't sound like an exciting thing to read. In fact, it starts with a sermon, which is a turnoff automatically, and I should know that. And I usually don't even refer to what I'm doing as preaching a sermon. I'll just say giving a talk or a message or something, just to take a little bit of the bite off, because we don't really find ourselves drawn to words. We're drawn more to action. But what Jesus did in his messages was to help people connect the miracles and the message. He gave meaning. People didn't really understand the meaning of the miracles without the message. It was what Jesus said that helped them understand why he was doing what he was actually doing. So I'm under no illusion that you're going to be more excited about reading another sermon, but I do know that you and I need to make sure that we have connected the why to what he did. Why did he do what he did? Well, we look at what he said. He explained it to us. And in Matthew chapter 5, we've got the beginning of this message on the mountain. And Matthew begins in his writing, recording, and what we're going to see is verse 3, when Jesus' words were, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven." It's as if Jesus was preparing the people for the next life, preparing people for what was going to come next. It wasn't just about what was happening then. It was more, there's going to be a day when you're a part of a different kingdom, if you follow me. And when you're a part of that kingdom, there is going to come a reward. So blessed are you who are doing this now, because you're going to experience something later. The older I get, the more this resonates with me. And the older I get, the more I begin to make sure that my wife knows where to find certain things. Should something unfortunate happen to me, I don't want to get all morbid today, but I never know, and I want to be prepared. So we've got this stuff, and if I try to talk about it, she shuts me down. I don't want to, we're going to have that talk. I'm like, we have to have that talk. Here's how it's going to go. Here's where to find this. Here's where to find that, because you never, ever know. So we don't like to talk about it, think about it. Jesus is speaking to some people there on the mountainside who don't want to think about it either. But Jesus says, here's the deal, guys. There's something on the other side. There's a kingdom that awaits, and you're going to, at best, spend 100 years here. And if you're part of that kingdom, you're going to spend eternity there. So you need to know that what you're doing here ultimately may not be rewarded until you get there. So he begins to talk to them about this idea of kingdom living, of this being temporary, that being eternal, this being something that's going to pass away, that being something that is never going to fade away, this being something that this is all there is, and over there's going to be so much more. And as I think through this, I think we need to acknowledge a feeling that most of us have, and that's that if if, and I'm going to clarify, I don't believe it later, but if this is all that there is, if we are truly cosmic accidents and we are just highly evolved animals, then these ideas of purity and mercy and patience and faith and choosing to suffer at times, those ideas are ridiculous concepts. Because if this is all that there is, why in the world would I put myself through that? Why would I work hard to try to live at peace with you if this is all it is? It doesn't matter, because if this is all it is, then the center of life is me. I am the center of my world, and I'll just make decisions based on me. But if there is a creator king who has a kingdom on the other side of this, and if his people are going to be with him there, and we're at most going to be here 100 years, and we're going to be there 1 billion years, then it makes absolute sense to focus on preparing myself for that. And like many of you, I'm caught in between. I know this doesn't last, but this is all I know. This is all I can see. I know that things that I accomplish here are not going to go with me to the kingdom. I understand that. But I'm not going to just sit here and do nothing along the way. And I even have some scripture to help me and back me up there. Rejoice in the Lord. This is the day the Lord has made. I will choose to rejoice and be glad in it. Make the most of every opportunity, because the days are evil. Even Jesus said, the thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy. I have come that you may have life and have it abundantly. And he wasn't just talking about the 1 billion years in the kingdom. He was meaning even right now. So there is a sense in which I understand this is not going to last forever, but I also know that this is all I know, and this is where I am for now. So the question that I have been wrestling with, that I want to give to you today, so you can share in my misery, is how do I live for what's next without missing what's now? How do I live for what is really going to matter and what's really going to last, all the permanent, eternal stuff, but at the same time, not miss out on the joy of this? It's easy for us to say, well, Christians have joy, and people who are not, they have happiness, and it's determined by their happenings. But God has not called us to hold on to this joy flag with a frown and saying, don't at me, I have joy in the Lord. Like, that's not it. There's a sense in which we are to soak all up that God has given us. I mean, he's given us this. This is a gift. That's why it's called the present. I learned that on Kung Fu Panda, but that's what we have. That's why it's called the present. It's a gift that God has given us. And so we want to enjoy this. We want to unwrap this gift, live it to the fullest, but not do so in a way that we forget that this is such a small drop in the bucket. And then all the things that we experience now, we're going to be left behind when God unfolds in glory his kingdom for his people. So how do I live for what's next without missing what is now? And it's this message on the mountain that Jesus gives, and certainly other parts of God's story, but in Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7, that Jesus helps us to understand what it is to live for now, but also prepare for then. And to do that, Jesus taps into something that the people understood. And we're going to find over and over again, he refers back to what they have thought up until that point. He refers back to their faith understanding, because for them, they had this bucket of stories and miracles that they all knew about. And then they had all these laws and things they were supposed to do and don't do and shan't do and shalt do and do this and do that. They had all of that, but they struggled to make the connection on how they were together. So Jesus taps into that. He reaches in the back of their minds and says, this is what you've thought all along, but let me turn this thing upside down and let you see this from my perspective so that you'll understand how these things actually work together. Now, when Jesus taught, he had different ways of teaching. Sometimes he would use illustrations. He would say, life is like this, or the kingdom is like this. And he would use earthly things that people could grasp a hold of to give them some understanding of a heavenly reality. Sometimes he would tell stories that would get a hold of their hearts. Talk about family, he would talk about friendship, he would talk about loss. He would explain things in a way they could grasp. Sometimes he would use illustrations with things that were around them. Take that tree, for example, that seed, for example, that flower, and he would talk about things in that way. But then we have this in the story where it's a full-on message. Where if it was happening now, it would be the time they took out their phones and they started jotting down because it was a lot to process. And that's what we're going to look at here today as he gave meaning to these miracles with the message. Now, as we go through this, you're going to see feel two groups present. There are common people who really don't grasp all of tomorrow, and they're really thinking mostly about today. Then you've got these religious leaders who were so focused on protecting God's kingdom that there was really no joy in what they were doing from day to day. And Jesus is speaking to both of them, and it shows up as he teaches. And in Matthew chapter 5, verse 17, you can almost feel the pride well up with these religious leaders. As Jesus said, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." And they're thinking, oh, Jesus is on our side, the side of the law. You do this, you do this, you do this, you do this, and you make it there. Like you've got this list of things you do and things you don't do. He apparently is on our side. But then in verse 20, Jesus said, "In fact, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven." Well, then the religious leaders, wait a minute. What do you mean by that? They need to be more religious than we are right now in order to get to the kingdom. So you're saying that we're not worthy of that as well. There's a lot going on as they're listening to him teach. There's not a lot of amen, yeah, that's right, keep on, get it, Jesus. Like none of that is happening. There's just a lot of, okay. Because their whole lives, they had been taught, do this, don't do that. Do this, don't do that. Do this, don't do that. And then every now and then a miraculous story. They had no concept of how it came together. And Jesus said, I'm not against the law, but I'm telling you, if it's just about the law, none of you are making it to the kingdom. So Jesus then begins to teach after he got their attention for sure. And in verse 21, he begins really several paragraphs of hitting on some common things for them and helping them see it from a completely different perspective. We'll start in verse 21, the first of these 6 little areas of life he talks about. He says, "You've heard it said that it was said to the people long ago, 'You shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment.' But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment." And he went on to say, when you get to church, if you remember, you realize in your heart that you're kind of sideways with somebody else, why don't you just leave your stuff at church, you go get it right, and then come back, because you can't be right this way if you're not right that way. And they sat and listened and thought, what? What do you mean? I thought we just weren't supposed to murder. Like, we didn't murder, we check it off. And Jesus said, really, it's more than that. In fact, you're guilty of this if you have hatred in your heart for someone else. So they're processing all that. He decides to move on to something that was even more difficult. Verse 27, he says, "You've heard it said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart." About the same amount of amens that we just had there. That's probably what he got. Might be a couple of ladies elbowing the man going, hey, amen, Jesus. But very little happening there. Very little. That's different. We needed a little pick-me-up. It's heavy in the room. I can feel the thickness. Jesus said, listen, you know it's been said, you don't have sex with someone you're not married to. Yeah, but I'm telling you it's even more than that. If it's happened in your mind, if it's happened with your eyes, then you're already guilty of that. And he would go on in the following couple of verses and say, if you struggle there, you might as well just gouge out your own eyes, because your eyes are going to drag you straight to hell. It'd be better if you just could be free from that. Not a whole lot of response, but Jesus knew that going in, because he's changing the way they're viewing life. They're viewing things as solitary, independent restrictions that God has placed on them, and Jesus is saying, no. I think you've missed the point. It's not just about not murdering someone or not going all the way and committing adultery. It's much more than that. We're looking at stuff on the inside. He goes on to a third area, and he says in verse 31, it's been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality makes her the victim of adultery, and anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Hard stuff to read for sure. But you had people abusing the process and thinking, I've just got a piece of paper. I can get rid of her and move on to somebody else. And Jesus is saying, no, you're missing it. You're not understanding what commitment in a relationship is all about. Difficult ways of looking at some very common restrictions that they had viewed in their lives. He moves on in verse 33 and says, again, you've heard it said to the people long ago, do not break your oath, but fulfill it to the Lord, the vows you have made. But I tell you, do not swear an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by earth, for it is his footstool. And he would explain it, and he would say, just let your yes be yes, your no be no. If you said yes, do it. If you said no, then stay away from it. Just keep your word. It's not about the oath and the honor, or I can do this because I didn't swear on the Bible. They said, just forget all of that. Just speak truth. You don't need to have all these vows and promises along the way. And people are listening in the crowd, and they're thinking, this is not how it was taught to us. And Jesus is trying to connect the message and the miracle, putting them all together and giving them meaning for the people. Then the fifth one, he says, you've heard it said in verse 38, eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. We've all heard this verse. And yet we've heard it, and at the same time, we know in our hearts the struggle. Maybe not the true struggle of living it out, but I mean, if you're like me, watching a movie or binging a show, and people are going through the storyline, and they're taking people out, and you just can't wait till they get murdered. Like we got it. And then we turn the movie off and go to bed. Dear Lord, help me to, what are we doing? We're drawn to it because we know the feeling. We know the feeling of being wronged and then stepping back and say, God, you better take care of them or I will. One of us, something's got to happen because that cannot go unpunished. We know that feeling. And Jesus was speaking to people with the same emotions. And he said, guys, when it happens, just turn. Turn your face. Let them do it again if they want to. And if they borrow from you, be okay with whatever happens to that. If they ask you to go a mile, you go 2 with them. If they ask you for clothes, give them the clothes off your back. Just be compassionate, be forgiving, be full of mercy. And the people listening, they're not any happier listening to this than you and I are when we read this. And then there's one final one in verse 43. He says, you've heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. The mental notes that were being taken were in overdrive, and the people were just blown away by what Jesus was saying. It's gotten familiar with some of us. We grew up in this churchy kind of environment, some of us did. And so we know these verses, we've heard many of them before. But this was brand new truth for those that Jesus was speaking to. And they're looking at their entire lives now upside down. Because from their perspective, I get into the kingdom if I do these things and don't do these things, as long as I don't murder anyone, as long as I don't commit legal adultery, as long as I don't get caught lying and breaking my oath, as long as they had all of these things that they were trying to keep. And Jesus said, really, it's much more than that. You're missing the point. Because until then, when they saw the king's rules, they just saw restrictions. They just saw prohibitions. They just saw, don't do this, don't do that, don't do that. They were all these standalone ideas. But what Jesus was doing was saying, these are not restrictions. These are invitations. And this is the king's invitation for you to understand even more. And in verse 48, he said, I want you to be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. In other words, you got to keep all this stuff, understand all of this, process all of this, work through all of this together. I'm not giving you restrictions. I'm telling you these restrictions were always invitations. Invitations to what? Well, what I want us to think through are just a couple of points here. The first is this: the king's laws are invitations to experience tomorrow's rewards today. The restrictions, the stay away from this, don't do this, watch out for this, all of that, those are actually invitations in which the king is saying, I'm going to reward you down the road for the decisions you're making now, but if you will live by my guidelines now, my principles now, you'll actually get a glimpse and a little taste of what's going to happen down the road, because you can experience the peace and the trust and the hope and the peace of mind and all of the relational harmony and just getting along and loving each other and experiencing mercy and compassion. You can experience a little bit of that now, when your entire life is going to be like that on the other side in the kingdom. He said, right now you can experience some of that, but you've got to follow my guidelines. He knew that for the people, just not murdering someone was not going to keep you in line and at peace with everyone else. And Jesus took it a step further and said, this was never just about bloodshed. This was about understanding that hatred rots your heart. And if you don't deal with it, you're going to never experience the life that I have for you to live. So deal with this. Deal with the thing that might lead to the extreme case of murder down the road, which it obviously doesn't most of the time. He said, but handle your bitterness. Handle your hatred now, because this is not the way I've created you to live. And you don't have to live this way right now if you'll just begin to live the kingdom rules while you're still here. He knew about adultery and how it was going to affect his people. And I know it's not very popular nowadays to even talk about that, because it's just a given that you're going to play around and mess around before you get married. But Jesus is saying, listen, you can deny it all you want, but when you're intimate with someone else, it involves your body, your mind, your spirit, your emotions, your mental part, your spiritual part. It's all wound up. And trust me, drama is going to come if you don't pay attention to this. So if you'll just do it my way, you will avoid a lot of this stuff down the road. And he looked at every one of those laws and said, this is not just about being able to say I kept the law. It's about living a kingdom kind of life. Which leads me to the second thing I want to leave with you today. It's, if the king will reward it, I won't regret it. Think through all the decisions that you make. And if your decision is rewardable, if God has said, if God has given you his word, given you his promise that I bless this, I will honor this is how I want you to live, then at worst, you'll have peace of mind. But at best, God is going to pour out his favor on you because you trusted him in that moment. But if I am willfully making a decision, I know God has said, Chad, that's off limits for you, then I am assured of experiencing regret. Now, for a moment, it might make me smile, might make me happy, feel good, think I'm something or whatever the case may be, but eventually I'm going to regret it. But if it's rewardable, if the king has said, I reward this, blessed are you who do this because I will reward that, then I know I'm not going to regret it. And then the third and the final thought, and this is a little, this is not profound, it's a little childish, but I did reference Kung Fu Panda, so we're okay. Aim for holy and find happiness. Aim for happy and find heartbreak. There's nothing wrong with pursuing happiness as long as we understand what gets us there is the target of holiness. I cannot find a single time in my life when I said, God, with all of my life, I am going to be set apart and live for you in this moment, and then walk away and think, that was a bad idea. I regret that. Never been a time. And I can think of very few times where the reward was not almost immediate. There's something about knowing that the King of Kings is looking down and saying, well done, that affects me in a way that no other compliment ever could by any person on earth. And if I'm aiming for holiness, I'm ultimately going to find the happiness that we're all pursuing. But if I'm just aiming to make me happy, there's a chance I'm going to get my heart broken fast, because I start with me and end with me and thinking I'm going to be the end all. It's just not the case. But if your target will be set on what is holy. Now, holy, we think about being religious. Holy and religious are not the same word. Holy means being set apart. And if we're a part of the kingdom, we are set apart. We are here for a different reason, to live a different way, and we're set apart. That's holiness. You aim for holy, and the happiness is going to follow, but not always if we aim for happiness first. Now, I don't know what your perspective is, and I don't know sometimes why you're even here. But I do know that God knows the heart. He knows why we're in this spot. And I heard a story. I'm not always supposed to hear things here. And sometimes I'm in the lobby and I hear things. I try to walk away, but then it's just too good. I get sucked in. And so I heard a story, and I don't want to give names. So I'll just say driver A was coming to church. And as driver A was coming to church, driver A was not driving as fast as driver B wanted driver A to be. So there was some tailgating, there were gestures and mirrors, there were lots of glances and looks, and eventually driver B passed driver A. Driver A said, fine, going to church, I'm over it, who's in a hurry to church anyway, so driver A was going to church, and then when driver A came down the road and turned right, where do you think driver B was going? So driver A just followed driver B right into the parking lot. And then they gathered for worship. I don't know why you're here. I don't know what your motivation is for being in God's presence. But I will tell you, if all you want is to somehow sneak into the kingdom and not go to hell, then just study God's laws, keep as many as you can, cross your fingers, and hope it goes well. But if you want to see the King, that's a different perspective. And if you want to see the King, then surrender your life to Jesus. Trust him enough to live the life that he's gifted you in the way he's asked you to live it. And you'll begin even now reaping the rewards that he talked about being reserved for those on the other side. Because we're in the in-between right now. We're not there yet. We're here, but we're not of this place. I mean, this is my home, but I don't belong here. And I'm headed there. And I've got at least another 30 seconds on this planet. I may have 30 years, but all I'm assured of is this right here, because surely God wouldn't make me, 30 seconds before I'm done. But I know I've got 30 seconds left here and maybe longer. I understand that, but this is not my place. This is not where I belong ultimately. And so I don't want to live by these rules, knowing that I'm going to spend an eternity there. So if you want to see the King, trust him enough to follow his guidelines. And that, I believe, is what Jesus was teaching as the way to live for there without missing out on what we have here.